welcome to episode 90 of Successful Demo. In each episode, I analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one more newly released cards. Jeez, that was a wake-up call. I mean, imagine if you woke up to a guy with that facial expression, wielding a baseball bat, holding it towards you. Yeah, not funny. Not funny at all. It's a very intimidating card, and I'm sure that's the feeling you get when you first look at this card. Yeah, all that bunch of text in the text box and the card art and so on. But you know what's the most key aspect of this card, the one that intimidates me the most? Yep, you guessed it. That's right. It's the reprisal subtype. Oh man, I'm so looking forward to more reprisal cards that shake up the game and define the theme of Wayland and maybe other factions as well. That aside, Wake Up Call really harkens back to an old card in Cerebral Cast, all the way back from Honor and Profit. They are so similar to the point where I wouldn't be surprised if Wake Up Call was balanced based on how Cerebral Cast was designed. They both cost 1 to play, they're both 3 influence pips in their respective factions, and they both own the Great Ops subtype. They also have 2 punishing effects, and the runner gets to choose between them. There's a lot of similarities, despite the rest of the differences being pretty huge. So I think it's worth comparing the two and seeing what sort of, because yeah, if you want to play Wake Up, if you want to ask yourself what kind of decks do you play Wake Up Call in, well, analyzing Cerebral Cast might be of some help. Now, to maximize the effectiveness of Wake Up Call, just like with Cerebral Cast, you need to build your deck around it because it has so many predicates. For Cerebral Cast, for example, you need a deck that can abuse both options, the brain damage and tag option. So in the past, one of the best decks you could use this with was with a Scorched Earth damage Jiteki deck. Of course, with Scorched Earth now no longer in the card pool, Cerebral Cast is a lot less good. But what about Wake Up Call? Well, if we read the text box, we can see that we need to be able to force the runner to run co-op cards and trash them. We need to be able to leverage the 4-meat damage in one of the options, and the other option means that we need to be able to benefit from hardware or resource trashing. That's the one that raises the most red flags for me. If you think about it, how do you build your deck around targeting a specific hardware or resource trash when you don't even know what runners you're going to face up against? So to me, that sends all sorts of red flags. I mean, you can't really build your deck around Wake Up Call's trash ability because you don't even know what resources or hardware you're going to be playing up against, and it's conditional at best. So even if there's a particular hardware or resource, say a film critic for example, they are scared of, you can't guarantee it's trash because the runner can easily pick the 4-meat damage option instead. Because of all these, I think it's not really good to use Wake Up Call as a hate card in the same way as you would, for example, use voter intimidation against film critic, or you know, something like a contract killer against a film critic. You can't build it that way. Instead, we must note the fact that Wake Up Call has some very good numbers on it. For the cost of a click and a credit, you get some very nasty effects. 4-meat damage, you know, even Scorched Earth has a 3 credit play cost and requires the tag prerequisite. For trashing a hardware or resource, 1 click and 1 credit is a bargain as well. If you think of something like Hunter Seeker, it costs 1 more click, 1 more credit, and you have the predicate that an agenda needs to be stolen. So because of this, Wake Up Call is a very good value card whenever you meet the prerequisite of the runner trashing a co-op card. The real question is, which trashable co-op cards best synergize with Wake Up Call? And given the emoji that's on the presentation, you know what time it is. It's time to pause the video and think about what sort of co-op assets or upgrades that you would play, or even operations, hint hint, boom, that you think best synergize with Wake Up Call. I want you to leave it in the comment section because this answer is actually very open-ended, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that what I'm about to propose is the definitive correct answer. I'd like to hear from all of you, so do pause the video, think about what assets and upgrades best synergize with Wake Up Call, and leave your answers in the comment section. And perhaps some explanations will be good as well. It might encourage me to build other Wake Up Call decks based on the assets or upgrades you suggested. Right, have you thought of it? Have you commented? If so, well, I think most of you, the first one of the cards that comes to the forefront when thinking about trashables is none other than the Force Trashable in Mumbad Virtual Tour. Of course, Force Trash is the best trash. It literally guarantees that you'll be able to fire off a wake-up call the turn after. The big problem I find with this is that it does not assist most Wayland win conditions. If we go back here, we can see that wake-up call is 3 influence. That's pretty expensive to import in the deck you would most likely see Mumbad Virtual Tour in, which is a CTM tag-based deck. That's very expensive for wake-up call. So yeah, without any good Wayland archetypes that can make good use of Mumbad Virtual Tour, it doesn't seem like this is actually the best fit. You would just be playing Mumbad Virtual Tour solely for the sake of activating Wake Up Call. Not that good. Instead, my mind wanders to Prisec and Ben Musashi, 2 cards that threaten damage if the runner chooses not to trash them, and even if they do, they might have to sustain damage while doing so as well. This is the perfect way to synergize with an operation that does damage. If you think about it, they run the Prisec, they take 1 meat damage. If they trash the Prisec, they are threatened by a follow-up 4 meat damage from Wake Up Call. That's a lot of damage to be taken. And if they choose to leave the Prisec there, you won't get to fire off the Wake Up Call. But if you install other upgrades or assets or agendas subsequently on that Prisec, they have to run it again, they'll take the meat damage again. It's a good way to protect your Prisec and or to get loads of meat damage off. That's what I love about Prisec. Ben Musashi, kind of the same thing as well, except that it actively protects your agendas with the 2 net damage that cannot be prevented. Well, if they prevent it, they can't steal the agenda. So obviously, Ben Musashi and Prisec seem to go very well with Wake Up Call because they are basically must trashes in a sense. Otherwise, the runner will be taking too much damage. And once you identify these cards, it starts becoming very clear that we aren't actually going to build a Wayland deck, because Wayland, to be honest, doesn't have the best damage capabilities in the entire card pool. Their damage cards are wonky at best. I mean, Wake Up Call is a very good example of that, but when you think of cards like Mr. Stone, cards like Chief Sleep, those have some really wonky requirements, and given that Wake Up Call is already a very janky card that requires a lot of building around, it's not very good to include more janky cards that take up lots of deck slots and require a lot more support, right? So instead, we want cards that by themselves contribute to the damage win condition of that Wake Up Call and Ben Musashi and Prisec provide you. So obviously, Obokata Protocol is arguably the best card that enables this, because more net damage, 4 net damage on top of 4 meat damage, it's a lot of damage to take. And, after playing a Wake Up Call, your Obokatas are basically protected. They protect themselves until the runner is able to draw back up. So with all that said, this is the deck I'm looking at. I won't go into too much detail explaining it, just note that influence that wasn't spent on Wake Up Call was all dumped into Fairchild 2, which is the perfect ice. Forcing the runner to trash their own rig and take brain damage. That's exactly what Wake Up Call does, dealing damage and trashing cards. So they all feed into each other very nicely. Other than that, it's a pretty standard Ag Infusion deck where you are leaning on Nisei Mark IIs and Excaliburs to keep the runner out, but you also have a lot of damage threats that the runner must adequately deal with. Ultimately, the objective is to give the runner a very difficult maze of puzzles to navigate around, where they must spend their credits and cards wisely. If they spend too much of one resource, they might end up getting starved of it. In the case of losing too many credits, they'll open a scoring window for the corp. If they lose too many cards, they might get flatlined. This is classic Tempo Jinteki at its finest. Let's watch it play out. Our opponent today is the world's best mum, and we open with the world's best opening hand. 3 money cards, 3 pieces of painful ice, and a celebrity gift among the money cards to show off the clean hand. You can't ask for anything more than this. Against Sunny, where you need to rush out as quickly as possible, it pays when you can build 1 ice R&D, dedicate all the rest of your ice to the scoring remote, and win before the runner can even set up any money. Set out the entire rig. So now my opponent gets out 2 econ cards, the data folding and the Mr. No Phones. So my opponent has a pretty good early money lead. Knowing that I have DNA Tracker and Fairchild 2, actually, it would have been in my opponent's best interest to challenge that remote if they knew it was an agenda. Of course, they didn't know that I top decked the Philotic, but one of the best times to challenge the DNA Tracker is actually when you're poor, because the DNA Tracker then only does 3 damage, the credit loss is irrelevant. So thankfully my opponent did not run it. That would have been quite bad for me, but I do get a Philotic out. It does no net damage, but the main point is to get some agenda points on the table as soon as possible. Now my opponent runs HQ here just to keep me honest, but they know that any agendas I draw off the top of R&D are going straight into the remote. There we go. Nisei goes straight into the remote. Fairchild 2 onto my remote as well, and playing the last economy card from my hand. So that's how we do it here. Empty HQ, we just pump out agendas as soon as we draw them. Now my opponent here Jack Sinclair's into HQ, getting lots of value of the Jack Sinclair. Not really, until they reveal they had Maxwell James and another paycheck. So suddenly my remote's under siege, and I realize that this deck has basically no end run ice. I can't keep my opponent out. It's a Fairchild 2 into DNA Tracker. My opponent had to suffer the Fairchild 2. We're running with only 1 click remaining. They couldn't break with clicks and was forced to take all 3 subroutines to the face. The brain damage is especially nice, given that I'm running a damage-based deck. And the first 2 subroutines will definitely slow my opponent down a bunch, given that they don't really have good economy set up just yet. They were forced to trash the Parisia there and lose 2 credits, I believe. Yep, and they take a brain damage. Now, they did not use Maxwell James here because they knew the Inner Ice was going to be something really nasty, something like a DNA Tracker. So the real question for me here is, do I res the DNA Tracker and have my opponent sack Maxwell James? My answer was yes. It was worth it to lose 8 credits just to get the Maxwell James threat off the table. Either way, I was going to lose the Nisei. Nothing I could do about that. But the main thing I wanted to do here was to force the Maxwell James off the table. I knew that I was not going to keep my opponent out of HQ. If I defend HQ too well, my opponent would have the time to set up the rig, and my remote would be penetrable anyway. So what I needed to do here was to just rush out as quickly as possible and, bypass those Maxwell Jameses. So in the meantime, I'm just going to click for credits because I need to compensate for the fact that I just lost a bunch of credits to resing that DNA Tracker that just got immediately de-res. Maxwell James is so powerful in Sunny because it augments her link, which he has a lot of use for. It's a pretty cheap resource, and allows you to contest remotes, which is the single biggest weakness of Sunny, not being able to contest remotes early on. Alright, so my opponent continues setting up here, finding their 3rd money card in the data folding. So that is definitely not good news for me. I need to start scoring out much faster. Losing the first Nisei really hurts. That would have been much more preferable had it been, say, an Orbo Carter protocol. That was much harder for my opponent to steal. Instead, this Nisei is something that I could have really used to keep my opponent out of my servers at a critical time. As you know, in most scoring Jinteki decks, you usually chain Niseis. The first Nisei helping you score the second Nisei and so on. I don't really have the luxury of that this game because the window to score Nisei has kind of passed, and I don't really have any of those trashable upgrades, the Ben Musashis, the Pricex that I need to trigger Wake Up Call that's in my hand. Unfortunately, in hindsight's 2020, isn't it? My opponent just installed a second Maxwell James and laughs at me as I realized that my attempt to res the innermost DNA Tracker was a huge mistake. My opponent seemed to have an endless tap of Maxwell James, and yeah, that's not something I can keep up with. So I draw an Orbo Carter protocol here just as my opponent spent all their money installing a security nexus. I thought to myself, there is no way in heck I'm gonna win against a Sunny late game, especially given their feedback filter out now. Kakugo is not very useful. It's now or never. I need to get this Orbo Carter going, which, by the way, cannot be deflected by feedback filter. If you deflect the net damage, you're not going to steal the Orbo Carter. So I'm going to try to score it here. My opponent attempts to run my HQ in order to get a Maxwell James trigger, so that they can start running my remote and de-resing ice, but I thwart their plans with yet another Fairchild 2. They could attempt to use their Nexus to get past this, but this means they won't have the use of Nexus for the remote, which is undesirable. Also, I'm banking on the fact that I have Agin Fusion's ability to keep my remote safe. This is why I'm pretty confident that I can score the Obo Kata here. They will have to run my remote Fetch Out 2 at least twice, in addition to this Fetch Out 2 that they're encountering on HQ right now. My opponent correctly deduces that they have no way of get past this, so they just click the Fetch Out 2, pay 2 credits, and with 2 clicks remaining, decide to let me have the Obo Kata. Running HQ there with Jack Sinclair was probably a mistake, and the price they paid was that they allowed me to get to match point. Now, they don't exactly know my agenda suite, but I don't actually have any more 3-2, so unfortunately, not much of a never advanced threat I can place, and definitely no fast advanced threat with shipment from 10 in. Even though I'm running the shipment from 10 in, there are no more 3-2 agendas in my deck, so unfortunately I can't threaten that. Now, this is where the game starts getting really dicey for me. Even though I'm on match point, I've let this game go on for a bit too long, and I'm a bit too poor to close out the game right now. This would be a good turn to close out the game right now, right here, if I had the winning agenda in hand and enough money to score it. I don't have both of that. So this is going to be a big problem, as my opponent is now pretty well set up. They don't have all their breakers, but they do have the Nexus and the Maxwell James to threaten the remote. And yeah, I'm still very far away from winning, so I started defending R&D with more ice. Reason being that my opponent is using Jack Sinclair willfully, and I need to punish them for that. So the moment they Jack Sinclair on R&D, I immediately said, well, no thank you, you're going to face plant this Fetch Out 2. They use Nexus to get past the Fetch Out 2, and not much I can do about that. And this is why Nexus is such a pain, because normally this is something you can rely on as Agin Fusion, the ability to just knock your opponent into nasty ice and force them to lose tempo. Well, for my opponent, they didn't have to lose tempo at all. If anything, I gave them another turning wheel counter, because redirecting the R&D run into HQ does not change the fact that they are getting a turning wheel counter off that. They also are able to bypass my Fetch Out 2 for free with Nexus, and then get an Armor Core down, greatly accelerating their remote lock game, because now not only are they getting turning wheel counters, they are getting through my servers, and they're getting Armor Core counters as well, building up very fast, very strong, and now I have a good amount of credits. And now I had to spend all my money to rest this Fetch Out 2 here. Meanwhile, on their end, they have 9 credits and are getting a good amount of drip econ every single turn. As my opponent continues rampaging all over my centrals, collecting free Armor Core and turning wheel counters as they go, I sit here asking myself, what's my out? I stare at my hand. The Neuro EMP is a dead card against Feedback Filter. The shipment from Tenon isn't going to win me the game, as explained earlier, and the wake up calls are never going to trigger. Sure, my opponent has installed an Imp, but they know that I have wake up call in my hand. They're not going to use Imp aggressively, right? So this is gonna be a really tough situation for me to crawl from. I had in mind the Excalibur on remote plan to win. The idea was to force my opponent to run through the Excalibur, which they could only break with Nexus. But ever since the Armor Core hit the table, that's yet another way my opponent has to break that Mythic Ice, which means that is no longer a good win con for me. I'm pretty stuck right here.
Tomorrow.
Hey look, I draw a Prisec. I might not have Excalibur as a win con, nor do I have a Nisei token, but perhaps this Prisec into Wake Up Call combo could form a win condition in and of itself. You'll never know. I'm gonna try, but I'm not exactly holding high hopes here. In fact, this situation is turning really bad for me. Every time my opponent starts my turn, they gain at least 5 drip credits from their resources. Then Nexus a run on a central for free, and it's of their choice. Even though I put the Prisec on R&D, they are running HQ. Not only definitely avoiding my wake up call, but more importantly, also denying my double shipment from Tenon, preventing me from scoring a Nisei if I top deck it.
Several bad puns later.
Hey look, another Prisec. Well, my instinctive reaction here was obviously to place the Prisec on HQ. That way I can deter turning wheel runs on both HQ and R&D. However, yep, You might have thought of it, I do have a better plan up my sleeve. First step, take some time to ponder over this decision. Make it look like I'm thinking and mulling and having a hard time, when honestly this is a pretty straightforward decision. I'm going to jam the Prisec in the remote and make it seem as though I'm waiting for my opponent to not run so that I can use double shipment from 10 in on it. There's also the threat that it could be a brain trust. My opponent has to check it. So I'm just looking at my eyes here to pass the time before finally installing this and taking a couple of credits. My opponent will run it for sure. The question is, what do I do when my opponent actually runs my remote? It's very context dependent. First, my opponent triggers Jack Sinclair on Archives, gaining 1 Omaqua counter. This is actually quite important. My opponent knows there's a DNA tracker somewhere, but well, they're not going to worry about the DNA tracker, it seems like, because they're just going to drop their Sherman, the barrier breaker, and then run my remote. So here, obviously, using the last piece of Unrest Ice, the one deepest in the remote, to trigger Ag Infusion's ability is the best. However, as I know that this is not an agenda, I don't want to waste my Innermost Ice on booping. Instead, I'm going to use the Outermost Excalibur, which I have now resigned to the fact that it's not going to be a useful win condition due to Omaqua. I'm just going to sack it so that I force my opponent to get through HQ, and then they run my remote, and then hit the Prisec, which they then trash. I repeat, they trash the Prisec. Now I wish I had my face cam active during this video, because I can't put into words the amount of glee I had clicking on the wake up call. So many turns after I initially drew it, I finally get the fire off, and no juicier target can you get in this current meta than a security Nexus, costing 8 credits and no sacrificial construct to protect it from the trash. It's going down. Now my opponent could have chosen to take the 4 meat damage and empty their hand instead, but well, a lot of unknown factors, right? You don't know the corp's entire hand, you don't know what the corp is running. Even with feedback filter out, they played it safe. They trashed their security Nexus rather than risking a flatline with 2 clicks from me left to go. So with 2 clicks remaining, I stare down my hand and I see that other wake up call in there, and I'm like, we could get a little greedy with this. Now here's the problem. I can't target down any of my opponent's resources because there's a fall guy on the board. Now, the options of taking 4 meat damage or trashing one of your cards on wake up call does not constitute a cost. Therefore, my opponent can prevent it even if they select that option. What this means is all their resources are basically immune because they can easily just sack the fall guy to prevent it instead. Anyway, the most important resource by far is the turning wheel, which has a lot of counters on it, and that's immune as well because it's a virtual resource. So with the remaining hardware, neither of them looks very appealing, but I'm going greedy and sniping the sports hopper instead. My thinking here is that if I can force a meat damage flatline or an Obo Carter steal, I do not want my opponent to be able to draw up an instant speed to then steal the Obo Carter. This deck works off the basis of compressing the runner's clicks and sports hopper, thwarts that by allowing my opponent to draw up in a pinch. As a bonus, my opponent also loses 1 link. That should help matters a bit. So that motivated my hopper target, and obviously my opponent chose to sack the hopper as it was pretty inconsequential. As you can see, I'm immediately consumed by regret when my opponent hosts the security Nexus on the supplier. I thought most Sunny decks only run 2. Turns out this person was running 3, and yeah, that wake up call was for nothing. Given they were rich, that tempo hit from installing the new Nexus is probably next to nothing. So yeah, I mean, you can't blame me for being greedy. I really did not think that my opponent would ever give me another wake up call trigger again. So may as well just, fire off all my wake up calls rather than to wait for a wake up call trigger that would never ever come again in the runner trashing my card. So my opponent now sweeps my hand and are going to guarantee themselves the Obo Carter. That is, if they choose to steal it. It's the first card of 3 they access. They have to be careful. They might be thinking, what if I hit a trap? Something like a breach dome would flatline them. They only have 4 cards in hand, so yeah, very tricky decision here, but eventually my opponent does pull the trigger and drops their entire hand to get up to 6 points with the freedom through equality in play, meaning they are now on match point. I'm kind of okay with that. That is a really significant tempo hit, and the net damage did snag some interesting stuff from the hand as well. There's a rigged results in the bin. Go figure.
One eternity later.
Guess what? I drew my third wake-up call. Now I really wish I had held back on the second wake-up call that I played earlier.
A few moments later.
Guess what? I just drew another upgrade. This time it's the Ben Musashi. Gonna be interesting, and we are gonna do exactly the same thing as we did with the Prisec. Really, we are really coming down to dragging our opponent through the remote every single darn time because they keep turning off our shipment from Tenin every turn. So I have to force them to keep running the remote. It's not like it's really taxing them. If you look at their setup, they have 2 data foldings, 2 Mr. Not phones, and yeah, that's just way too much money for me to tax out, even though I have Fairchild 2s on every important server and even IP block that taxes the runner because they are on Ormaquah and AI Breaker. They take tags every HQ run. Yeah, and they are forced to run HQ every turn to defuse the shipment from Tenin because there's a price tag on R&D, so they have to take the tag from IP block. They're still keeping afloat. They still start their turn with 20 credits. There's nothing I can do about this. My ice is simply not taxing enough, and I don't have enough ice to deal with the security nexus threat. My win conditions are all but gone, but I'm just logging it out for now. I mean, the game would be long over had I drawn any more agendas. It seems like my agendas are all hiding in the deck. The game has gone on for a lot longer than it seems, because I've cut out most of the portions, as you may have noticed, but trust me, I've been drawing through most of my deck already, and there's still a disproportionate amount of agendas remaining in the deck. So, as I mentioned, I've lured them into this server again. I need to consider which ice to res, whether to boop them with Egg Infusion. Because this is not an agenda, there's no point in wasting my Egg Infusion boops, or rather the unres ice. I don't want to have to patch them up again. Instead, I'm going to res the DNA tracker here. Now, my opponent could have de-resed it with Maxwell James, but they preferred to keep the link. Instead, they used the security chip, which was pre-installed earlier, to get past it by boosting their Ormaquah. Without that, they wouldn't have been able to get past it because they already used their Nexus Trace and they did not have the Striker out. Now they finally do install the GS Striker. And because they trashed the Ben Musashi, I'm able to get the third wake-up call off. Oh, that's huge. That is absolutely huge because my opponent was forced to take the meat damage there. They could not afford to lose their final Nexus, which means they are down to 2 cards. You heard it, folks. You heard it right. We have managed to mill Sunny down to 2 HP. I never thought I'd see the day I'd mill Sunny, let alone with a deck that isn't dedicated mill like Potatoes Unleashed. We're playing a normal Egg Infusion deck that is supposed to go fast and click compress the runner, but this somehow turned out into a grind fest. One where my opponent drew too many cards themselves and took a bit too much net damage and meat damage from all my sources of damage. And now they can't steal the final Obo Carter. They don't run Film Critic. Their restricted card is Employee Strike, which never entered play. All of them got trashed one way or another. So the final Obo Carter in the deck is good, but unfortunately for me, that is the only remaining Obo Carter. The other 2 are in the score areas, so there are still a lot of live agendas in the deck. To be exact, there are 2 more Niseis and a final Future Perfect. Out of seemingly nowhere, I found myself a new win condition. Score the final Obo Carter in my deck, which the runner has no way of stealing.
2,000 years later.
Well, the time has finally come. I finally found an agenda. This is both good and bad news, because it's the winning agenda for both of us. I put it in the remote, knowing full well there's a very good chance my opponent's gonna check it, just like the Prisec before, just like the Ben Musashis before. I don't have a choice here. They're just gonna keep running HQ every turn otherwise, and chalk up those turning wheel counters. So, my opponent just goes straight for the juggler. On their Jack Sinclair run even, they can't use breakers here. They're just going to go for it first thing in the morning. Do I use Ag Infusion's boop here? Of course I do. They're gonna get in otherwise. So, I hit them onto Archives, which is really interesting, because this is a Jack Sinclair run. They cannot use their striker to break the crick. Either they Nexus trace through it, which they do. If they don't, they allow me to fire the crick, and I will install Ben Musashi in the remote, thereby making it very hard for them to steal it, that agenda, which could very well, you know, make the difference, the 2 net damage, even though they have exactly 2 hit points in hand. They can't take that risk, so they cannot let the crick fire, which means they've used up their Nexus here. They are forced to use normal breakers for the remainder of the ice. They use their striker to get through both ice, and they're gonna access the wing. Not just kidding, it's a Prisec. They are down to 1 HP. I've gotten them into Ben Musashi range, widening the number of outs I have. Again, just like feedback filter. Just like Obokata protocol. Feedback filter does not help you against Ben Musashi, as it's an additional cost. Now I'm gonna continue being tricksy with my moves. That Prisec was tricksy, but here's even more tricksy. I'm gonna have a 5 card HQ here, and I'm only gonna select give 4 of the cards, because honestly I don't need all the credits. I know there's no way I'm gonna tax the opponent out. So all I need is the money to install ice that I can use for Ag Infusion boops. So it doesn't really matter what ice I install here. The bottom line is I wanted to leave 1 hidden card in HQ to make them wonder whether I top deck an agenda. Hopefully that will induce more runs on HQ, maybe even induce them to use turning wheel counters on HQ, which would mean fewer turning wheel counters on R&D. That can only be good news. So hopefully this little ruse works. I'm really grasping at strings here for every single out I can get. Usually as core play you want to dictate the runner's information, and I'm doing that to some extent here, but it's only because I'm on the back foot. Unfortunately, Sunny goes for her usual morning run with Jack Sinclair and happens to access the 1 card in my hand I did not show her. The DNA tracker. Completely thwarting my ruse. Dang, you never try to ruse the security specialist. They always have their cameras pointed at you.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
This is it, folks. It's the final countdown. They have, what, 14 counters on that turning wheel? Yeah, they have been farming this entire game and are now fully equipped and can carry their team to victory. On the flip side, I'll just have to see here and watch Sunny access 8 of the 12 cards from my R&D. And of course, she pulls the winning agenda. Anticlimactic finish, I know, but you weren't really expecting anything else, now were you? The lesson learned from this game was very straightforward. Patience wins you games, and conversely, impatience loses you games. I was so impatient, I wanted to get the second wake-up call out of the way, ended up using it on an irrelevant target in the sports hopper, when I could have saved it for the second trigger in conjunction with the next the 4 meat damage to destroy the Nexus and leave my opponent in a very awkward situation where they cannot break sentries. I never realized that it would be my win con, but as they always say, hindsight is 20/20. The best players are those that have such foresight. Speaking of foresight, my opponent knew that their win condition was in remote locking me and not running R&D until they had to or they wanted to. They did a very good job with the remote lock, and I think a lot of you were screaming at various junctures in the game, why don't you as Sunny just run R&D? You're on match point, you have so many turning wheel counters, you're bound to get an agenda. I said the same to myself while playing out this 39-minute long game. That was a grind. But as it turns out, the agendas never came up. They all happened to be stuck at the bottom of the deck. So if my opponent had at any point earlier gone for the R&D big dig, they would have came up empty-handed, and they would have taken the Prisec damage from R&D, further accelerating my game. I would have been able to land a better wake-up call, grind down their hand, and probably steal a game which they very rightfully should have won, because they had every single means to lock my remote, and I couldn't score as long as they were running every turn, denying my shipment from tenants, denying my remote. My opponent played that perfectly to a T. Very well done. My verdict on Wake Up Call, well, you must keep in mind that even though it nearly was my win condition this game, and I just misplayed it at the end, this card was played in a very best case scenario. This particular game, you can't get a better game than this. I'll put it right there right now. This game featured the perfect trash target in Security Nexus, a high value and very expensive target that is not a program. In addition, I managed to draw all 3 wake-up calls. Had I had any fewer, it wouldn't have had the impact that I managed to pull off this game with. It also helped that all the winning agendas were at the bottom of the deck, meaning that I could drag the game out long enough for milling the runner to be a win condition, and that's where wake-up calls meat damage came in handy. And finally, my opponent did not have any hard counters to either the meat damage in prevention or the trash prevention. They could have been running Sacrificial Construct, for example. All these conditions contributing to a best case scenario for Wake Up Call. And it did okay. It wasn't outstanding. Personally, I'm not very impressed with this card. For a card that consumed more than half of Aginfusion's influence, and that's saying something by the way, it did not have the impact that I was hoping it would. So yeah, it's failed to impress me unfortunately, but as they always say, the proof is in the pudding. If anyone out there can show me concretely other users of this card which defy my expectations, I'd be all ears. I love to see what you can come up with using this card, but for now we'll just have to draw this chapter to a close. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy net running. Stay tuned to my channel for more successful demos.